The heavy rain was drumming a steady, violent rhythm against the roof of my sleeper berth, but it wasn't the weather keeping me awake. It was the weight of the envelope tucked under my visor, the edges frayed from years of being pulled out and stared at under the dim glow of truck stop halogen lights. I'd spent a decade convinced my past was a series of dead ends and unanswered silences, believing every word I'd written home from the desert and the road had been swallowed by the wind. I was just a ghost in a Peterbilt, hauling freight to forget a name I couldn't stop saying in my sleep. But as I pulled into that small-town cemetery and saw the rows of dress blues and the lone piper standing in the mist, the air in my lungs turned to lead. I didn't know then that the silence wasn't because she didn't care. It was because someone had been building a wall of lies between us, brick by bitter brick, and today was the day that wall was going to come crashing down in front of everyone. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The wipers on the 389 were struggling to keep up with the deluge as I rolled through the iron gates of Oak Ridge Memorial. It was a grey, suffocating afternoon in North Carolina, the kind of day where the humidity clings to your skin like a damp wool blanket. I shouldn't have been there. My dispatcher had a load of refrigerated poultry headed for Charlotte that needed to be there by 0800, but some debts don't get paid in mileage. I parked the rig on the shoulder of the narrow access road, the big diesel engine chugging a low, mournful rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very soil of the graves around me. I climbed down from the cab, my boots sinking into the soft, hungry mud. I didn't have a suit. I had a clean work shirt, a pair of dark jeans, and a faded black Carhartt jacket to hide the tremor in my hands. About 50 yards away, under a green canopy that looked flimsy against the wind, a small crowd had gathered. Most of them were in uniform, shining medals, crisp creases, the kind of rigid posture that comes from years of following orders. And then there was the man standing at the head of the casket, Colonel Marcus Thorne. He looked exactly the same as he did 12 years ago at Fort Bragg, jaw like a granite block, eyes that searched for weakness like a hawk looking for a field mouse. He was my commanding officer before I traded the rucksack for the steering wheel, and he was the reason I'd spent the last decade believing I was a forgotten man. He stood next to a woman I recognized only from old, tattered Polaroids, Elena's mother, Martha. She looked frail, her face a map of grief leaning heavily on a cane. I stayed back, hovering near a large oak tree, the rain dripping off the brim of my cap. I wasn't invited. In fact, the last time I'd spoken to Thorne, he told me in no uncertain terms that my instability made me a liability to the family, and that Elena was moving on with someone who actually had a future. He'd intercepted my letters when I was deployed, told her I'd stopped writing, and told me she'd stopped waiting. I'd spent 10 years on the interstate trying to outrun that rejection, only to find out through a chance encounter with an old unit buddy that Elena had passed away after a long illness, and that she'd died wondering why I never said goodbye. The anger was a slow, thawing ice in my chest. I watched Thorne adjust his cap, looking every bit the grieving, honorable father. But I knew the man behind the medals. He was a manipulator who treated people like assets to be managed. To him, a lowly sergeant with a service-connected attitude problem wasn't fit for his daughter. As the chaplain began to speak, his voice carrying over the wind, a black SUV pulled up behind my truck. 2 men in suits got out. Private security, likely hired by Thorne to keep the riffraff away. They spotted me immediately. I'm not a small man. The road puts a certain kind of hard muscle on your frame, and my face carries the geography of a life lived outdoors. They started walking toward me, their hands hovering near their belts. "This is a private service, sir," the taller one said, his voice a low growl. "You need to move along." I didn't move. I didn't even look at them. I kept my eyes on the casket. "I'm just here to pay my respects," I said, my voice like gravel under a tire. "The colonel was very specific about who belongs here," the second one added, stepping into my personal space. He reached out to grab my shoulder, a mistake he wouldn't realize until he was on the ground. I didn't wait for him to close the distance. I stepped inside his reach, my hand snapping up to catch his wrist, while my other forearm slammed into his chest, using his own momentum to send him skidding back into the mud. The taller one lunged, swinging a heavy fist toward my jaw. I ducked, the air of the punch whistling past my ear, and drove a hard, short blow into his midsection. He wheezed, doubling over, and I didn't give him time to recover. I grabbed the scruff of his jacket and his belt, pivoting on my heel, and sent him stumbling toward the open door of their SUV. "I'm staying," I said, my breath steady, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, cold focus. "And if you try that again, I won't be so polite." They scrambled back, one of them reaching for a radio, but they stayed clear. They saw the look in my eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and a decade's worth of debt to collect. I turned back to the service, my boots squelching in the mud, as the chaplain reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper that looked suspiciously familiar. The chaplain's voice trembled slightly as he unfolded the yellowed stationery, the paper fluttering like a trapped bird in the rising wind. I stood as still as the headstones around me, my knuckles still throbbing from the contact with the security guard's chest. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth, a sensory trigger that sent my mind racing back to a humid tent in the middle of a desert, writing by the light of a flickering headlamp. I knew that paper. I knew the way the ink bled slightly on the third line because my pen was running dry. "Before we conclude," the chaplain said, his voice gaining strength, "the family has asked me to read a letter that was found tucked away in Elena's private belongings. It arrived years ago, but it seems she held on to it until her final breath." Colonel Thorne stood tall, his chest puffed out, a mask of practiced sorrow on his face. He didn't know. He thought he'd scrubbed the world clean of me. He thought every letter had been intercepted, every memory of Jack Mercer incinerated. But as the chaplain began to read, the mask started to crack. "Dear Elena," the chaplain began, "the stars out here don't look like the ones back in Carolina. They're colder, but every time I look up, I tell them to find you. I've sent 12 letters this month. I don't know if the mail trucks are getting through the pass, or if you've just decided that a man in a dusty uniform isn't worth the wait. But I need you to know, I'm coming home. I'm coming home for you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Martha, Elena's mother, let out a soft, broken sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Thorne's head snapped toward the chaplain, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suppressed rage. He stepped forward, his hand out as if to snatch the paper away. "That's enough," Thorne barked, his voice cutting through the solemnity like a serrated blade. "This is a private moment. We don't need to air the ramblings of some drifter." "It's not ramblings, Marcus," Martha whispered, her voice surprisingly sharp. "It's the truth she never got to hear. I didn't stay by the oak tree anymore. The time for lurking in the shadows was over. I stepped out into the open, my heavy boots thudding against the grass. Every head turned. The veterans in the crowd recognized the gait, the steady, rhythmic pace of a man used to carrying a heavy load. Thorne saw me then. His face went from pale to a deep, dangerous purple. "You!" he hissed as I reached the edge of the canopy. "I told you to stay away from my family. Security!" The two men I dealt with earlier were hovering by the SUV, nursing their bruises and showing no interest in a round two. I ignored Thorne and looked directly at the chaplain. "Keep reading," I said. It wasn't a request. Thorne lunged at me, his dignity forgotten. He was a man used to being obeyed, used to moving people like chess pieces on a board. He tried to grab my lapel to shove me back, but I was faster. I caught his forearm in mid-air, my grip tightening until I felt the bone groan beneath his expensive wool sleeve. I didn't hit him. I just held him there, a foot from my face, so he could see the 10 years of road-weary exhaustion and cold fury in my eyes. "You told her I stopped writing," I said, my voice low enough that only those under the canopy could hear. "And you told me she'd moved on. You killed us both long before she ever got sick." I saved her from a loser, Thorn spat, though his voice lacked its usual command. A man who couldn't even keep his head straight after a little combat. You were nothing. I was the man she loved, I replied. I shoved his arm down, a sharp, decisive movement that sent him stumbling back against the floral arrangements. The crowd was frozen. This wasn't just a funeral anymore. It was an execution of a reputation. The chaplain, a man of God who clearly recognized a moment of reckoning when he saw one, cleared his throat and continued reading the second half of the letter. It was the part where I described the house I wanted to build for her, the one with the porch facing the mountains. It was the part where I promised her that no matter how far the army or the world took me, I would always find my way back to her side. As the words filled the air, the wind seemed to die down, leaving only the sound of Martha's weeping. She walked toward me, her cane clicking on the temporary wooden walkway. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face for the boy I used to be. "Jack?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Martha," I said, my voice finally breaking. "I never stopped writing. I never stopped trying to get back." She reached out and touched my arm, her fingers light as a feather. "She waited, Jack. Even when Marcus told her you'd married someone else in Germany, she kept those letters hidden under her mattress. She told me once that the paper smelled like you, like diesel and desert wind." Thorn tried to intervene again, his face a mask of desperation. "Martha, don't listen to this. This man is a vagrant. He's a trucker who spends his life running away from responsibility." That was the spark. I turned on him, my shadow falling over him like a storm cloud. "I don't run," I said. "I haul the weight of the world, while men like you sit in air-conditioned offices, deciding whose lives are worth more than others. You want to talk about responsibility? You stole 10 years from your daughter because your pride was too big to let her love a sergeant." One of the younger officers, a captain who had been standing near the back, stepped forward. He looked at Thorn, then at me, then at the medals on Thorn's chest. The silence was absolute. Then the captain did something that broke Thorn completely. He snapped a crisp, textbook-perfect salute, not to the colonel, but to me. "Welcome home, Sergeant Mercer," the captain said. Thorn looked around, realizing the room, the cemetery, the world had shifted. His authority was a ghost. His lies were laid bare in the mud. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the casket, then at his wife, who had turned her back on him to hold my hand. I looked down at the letter in the chaplain's hand. The ink was faded, the paper was torn, but the truth was finally breathing. The injustice that had fueled my engine for 3,000 miles a week was finally being dismantled. But the cost was the woman in the box. "There's one more thing," the chaplain said, looking at me with a sad smile. "There was a second envelope, a recent one, addressed to the man who keeps the road." He handed it to me. My fingers shook as I took it. It was Elena's handwriting, weak, slanted, but unmistakably hers. She'd written it in the hospice, knowing I was out there somewhere, still driving, still searching for a destination I couldn't name. The security guards were long gone. The rain had turned into a soft, cleansing mist. I stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of my past and the wreckage of Thorn's legacy, and realized that the road hadn't been leading me away from her. It had been leading me right here, to this moment of terrible, beautiful clarity. The weight of that second envelope felt like a lead brick in my palm, heavier than any oversized load I'd ever hauled over the Rockies. I looked at Thorn, who was shrinking into his uniform, the medals on his chest looking like hollow trinkets in the face of Martha's cold silence. The captain who had saluted me remained at attention, a silent sentinel for a brotherhood that transcends rank and time. "You should leave, Marcus," Martha said, her voice brittle but unbreakable. "You've done enough damage for one lifetime." Thorn looked like he wanted to roar, to reclaim the command he'd held for decades, but the eyes of every soldier under that canopy were on him, and they weren't looking at a leader. They were looking at a man who had used a military machine to wage a private war against a heart. He turned on his heel, his boots clicking with a hollow sound on the pavement as he retreated toward the black SUV. The security guard scrambled to open the door for him, and as the vehicle peeled away, splashing mud onto the manicured grass, the atmosphere beneath the canopy finally shifted. The chaplain stepped back, giving me a nod of profound respect, and the crowd began to disperse into the mist, leaving me alone with Martha and the casket. My hands were still shaking, a fine tremor that started in my marrow and radiated out to my fingertips. I walked over to the edge of the grave, the smell of fresh-turned earth and rain-soaked lilies filling my head. I reached out, my rough, calloused hand resting on the cold, polished surface of the wood. "I'm here, El," I whispered, the words catching in a throat that had been tight for 10 years. "I never stopped driving toward you." Martha stood beside me, her hand slipping into the crook of my elbow. She knew Jack. Deep down, she always knew. She used to watch the highway from the window during the bad months. She'd see those twin headlights cutting through the dark and tell me, "That's him, Mom. He's just got a few more miles to go." The pain of those words was a physical blow, a dull ache in my chest that no amount of highway miles could ever numb. I opened the letter she'd written from the hospice. The handwriting was a ghost of her former self, shaky, the loops of the letters collapsing under the weight of her illness. "My dearest Jack," it read, "if you're reading this, the wind has finally blown my letters into your hands. My father is a man of stone, but even stone cracks eventually. I know you didn't leave me. I felt you in every sunrise I saw from my bed, and in every rumble of a truck passing by the hospital. Don't let the anger keep you in the fast lane, Jack. There's a box in the floorboards of my old room, under the loose plank by the radiator. It's for you. It's the life we were supposed to have. Find it, and then find your peace. I'll be waiting at the last stop." I folded the paper carefully, tucking it into my breast pocket right against my heart. I looked at Martha. "The house in Raleigh. Is it still—" "He hasn't touched her room," Martha said, a shadow of grief crossing her face. "He couldn't bring himself to go in there. But I have the key." She pressed a small brass key into my hand. "Go tonight, Jack, before he finds his spine again and tries to lock you out." I walked back to the Peterbilt, my mind a whirlwind of static and sudden sharp clarity. I climbed into the cab, the familiar scent of old coffee and diesel acting as a brief anchor. I checked my mirrors, my eyes catching the reflection of the cemetery fading into the grey horizon. I had a load to deliver, a life to reclaim, and a confrontation with the past that was only just beginning. I pulled out of the memorial grounds, the 18-wheeler groaning as it gained speed. But as I hit the main road, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror that hadn't been there before. A dark sedan, weaving through traffic with a reckless desperation. Thorne wasn't going to let me walk away with the truth. He was coming to finish what he started 12 years ago, and this time there were no cameras, no chaplains, and no rules. I shifted gears, the engine roaring in defiance. The road ahead was dark, and the stakes had just gone from personal to terminal. If he wanted a fight, I'd give him one, but it wouldn't be on his terms. It would be on the blacktop, where I was king, and where the truth always found its way to the surface. I watched the sedan through my side mirrors, its headlights bouncing as it hit the uneven shoulder, trying to whip around a slower-moving minivan. Thorne was driving like a man possessed, his arrogance translated into the screaming of tires and the smell of burning rubber. He didn't care about the lives he was endangering on this stretch of two-lane blacktop. He only cared about burying the evidence of his cruelty. As we hit the outskirts of town, the road opened up, carving a path through the dense pine forests. I let the Peterbilt stretch its legs, the turbo whistling a high-pitched warning. I knew every curve of this road, every dip where the shadows pooled deep and dark. Thorne, in his expensive city car, thought speed was the only factor. He didn't understand momentum. He didn't understand the sheer, unyielding power of 80,000 pounds when it's driven by a man with a purpose. The sedan lunged forward, trying to pull alongside me. I saw Thorn through his passenger window, his face contorted in a silent scream of rage. He jerked the wheel, attempting to pit maneuver my front tire. A move that would have been suicide for a smaller vehicle, but was merely a nuisance to the 389. I felt the jar through the steering column as his fender buckled against my steel lug nuts. I didn't flinch. I just held the line, steady and true. I waited for the right moment, the bridge over the deep river coming into view. The lane narrowed there, the concrete barriers leaving no room for error. I eased off the throttle just enough to let him think he was winning, let him pull his front bumper even with my cab. Then I dropped a gear and let the engine brake bark, a thunderous pop, pop, pop that echoed like gunfire off the trees. Thorn flinched. It was a small movement, a momentary lapse in his military discipline, but it was all I needed. I nudged the wheel a fraction of an inch to the left, reclaiming my space. The sedan's tires shrieked as they hit the gravel shoulder, sending a spray of stones against my fuel tank. He overcorrected, the car fishtailing wildly before he slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting the bridge abutment. I didn't stop. I kept the hammer down, the lights of the sedan receding in my mirror as he spun out into the muddy ditch. I knew he was alive. I'd seen the car come to a stop without flipping, but his path was blocked, his pursuit ended by the very road he'd spent a lifetime trying to control. I reached the rally house just as the moon was beginning to peer through the clouds. It was a grand, colonial-style structure, a monument to the prestige Thorn had craved. I parked the rig a block away, not wanting the noise to alert the neighbors. I walked up the driveway, the key Martha gave me feeling warm in my pocket. The house was silent, smelling of floor wax and stale air. I made my way up the stairs, my boots silent on the plush carpet. I found Elena's door at the end of the hall. It was exactly as I'd imagined it. White paint, a simple brass handle, a world of memories locked inside. I turned the key, the lock clicking open with a sound like a heartbeat. The room was frozen in time, a half-finished book on the nightstand, a dried rose in a vase, and the faint lingering scent of her perfume, the one that smelled like jasmine and rain. I went straight to the radiator, kneeling on the floorboards, just as she'd described. I felt along the wood until I found the loose plank. It came up with a soft groan, revealing a small, velvet-lined box. Inside were the letters I'd sent, the ones Thorn claimed never arrived, and beneath them a stack of envelopes addressed to me, stamped but never mailed. She'd been writing back the whole time. She'd been fighting her own war in this house, a war of words and hope against a father who wanted her to forget. I sat on the edge of her bed, the letters spread out around me like a map of the life we should have had. I read her words, her dreams of us starting over, of me leaving the service and us finding a small patch of land where the noise of the world couldn't reach us. She'd forgiven me for a silence I didn't even know I'd kept. I stood up, the box tucked under my arm. I looked out the window and saw the lights of a police cruiser pulling into the driveway. Thorn had called them, no doubt spinning a tale of a break-in by a dangerous drifter. But I wasn't afraid. I had the truth now, and I had the proof of his crimes, not just against me, but against his own daughter. I walked down the stairs, meeting the officers at the front door. I didn't say a word. I just held out the box and the letter she'd left for me at the funeral. I saw the recognition in their eyes as they read the name on the envelope. They knew Thorn, they knew the reputation, and they knew a man who had finally been caught in his own web of lies. "I think you need to come with us, Sergeant Mercer," one of them said, his voice quiet. "The colonel has some explaining to do." The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the polished chrome of my Peterbilt, casting long, jagged shadows across the driveway of the Thorn estate. I stood on the porch, the box of Elena's letters tucked firmly under my arm, watching as Colonel Thorn climbed out of a secondary police cruiser. He looked disheveled, his uniform tie pulled loose, the arrogance that had defined him for decades finally beginning to fray at the edges. He saw me standing there with the evidence of his decade-long deception, and for the first time, The granite in his expression crumbled into pure, unadulterated panic. "That's private property!" Thorne shouted, his voice cracking as he lunged toward the steps. "He's a thief! He's unstable! Arrest him!" The lead officer, a veteran sergeant with eyes that had seen too many respectable men hide behind their titles, didn't move toward me. He took the letter I held out, the one the chaplain had read at the memorial, and scanned it slowly. Then he looked at the velvet-lined box of intercepted mail. The silence that followed was heavier than the North Carolina humidity, broken only by the rhythmic chugging of my idling rig down the street. "Colonel," the officer said, his voice flat and dangerous, "we received a call about a domestic disturbance and a reckless pursuit on Highway 42. A witness saw your vehicle attempt to force a commercial truck off the Deep River Bridge." "I was protecting my family," Thorne bellowed, reaching for the box in my arms. He moved faster than I expected for a man his age, his hand clawing at the wood. I didn't back down. I stepped into his space, my shoulder dropping as I pivoted, catching his wrist and twisting it in a controlled joint lock that sent him to his knees. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about ending the cycle of control he'd exerted over everyone in his orbit. I held him there, pinned against his own pristine white pillars, until the officers stepped in to take over. "The dash cam on my rig caught the whole chase on 42, officer," I said, my voice low and steady. "Every swerve, every attempt to ram me, and the moment he lost it in the ditch. It's all recorded." Thorne let out a sound that was half sob, half growl as the handcuffs clicked into place. The old trucker he'd mocked and dismissed had been the one to finally draw the map to his undoing. As they led him away toward the cruiser, Martha stepped out from the shadows of the foyer. She didn't look at her husband. She looked at the box in my hands, her eyes brimming with a grief that was finally allowed to be honest. "Take them, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind in the pines. "They were always yours. He just stole the time." I walked back to my truck, the weight of the past 10 years finally lifting from my shoulders, replaced by a quiet, hollow peace. I climbed into the cab and pulled the visor down, looking at the frayed envelope I'd kept for a decade. I didn't need it anymore. I had the rest of the story now. I engaged the gears, the Peterbilt let out a deep guttural roar, and I began the long drive out of Raleigh. The road ahead was still long, and the miles wouldn't bring her back, but for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't running from the silence. I was just a man with a load to deliver, and a memory that finally had a place to rest. The rain had finally tapered off into a fine silver mist that hung low over the North Carolina pines, blurring the edges of the world until the only thing real was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I reached the outskirts of town, the lights of the Raleigh skyline shrinking in my mirrors, and pulled the 389 onto a gravel turnout overlooking a quiet valley. The engine idled with a rhythmic mechanical heartbeat, a sound that usually brought me peace, but tonight felt like a clock counting down the moments I'd lost. I reached over to the passenger seat and pulled the velvet-lined box into my lap. The wood was smooth, worn by years of Elena's touch as she hid it away from a father who tried to rewrite her heart. I picked up the first envelope from the stack she'd written, but never mailed. The date on the postmark was from 3 years ago, a night when I was probably battling a blizzard in the Sierras, convinced that the only thing waiting for me at the end of the line was more highway. "Jack," the letter began, the ink crisp despite the years. "I saw a truck today with the same mud flaps you used to joke about. I chased it for 3 miles, hoping to see your face in the mirror. I know you're still out there. I can feel the miles between us, but I can also feel the string that pulls us back together. Don't let the road make you hard, Jack. You were always the gentlest man I knew, even when the world tried to break you. Drive safe. I'm keeping the porch light on." I felt a tear trail down my cheek, hot and stinging against skin that had been weathered by wind and salt. For a decade, I'd carried a bitterness that acted like extra weight on my trailer, slowing me down, making every hill steeper and every night longer. I thought I was an island, A ghost in a machine, forgotten by the only person who ever saw the man behind the rank and the uniform. But the truth was, I'd never been alone. She'd been there in every gear shift, every sunrise, and every quiet mile. The injustice Thorne had served us was a heavy debt, and while he was sitting in a cell facing the wreckage of his own pride, it didn't give me back the years. It didn't give me the quiet mornings or the house with the porch facing the mountains. But as I sat there in the dim glow of the cab, I realized that his plan had failed. He'd tried to kill our connection with silence, but her voice was louder than ever now. He'd tried to make me a drifter, but she'd given me a destination. I took the small brass key Martha had given me and tucked it into the velvet box, closing the lid with a soft click. I wasn't the same man who had rolled into that cemetery this morning. That man was fueled by ghosts and old anger. The man sitting here now was carrying a legacy. I put the truck back into gear, the air brakes hissing as I prepared to merge back into the flow of the interstate. I had a delivery to make in Charlotte, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just driving to finish a job. I was driving because it's what I do. I'm a trucker. I carry the things that people need, and sometimes I carry the things that people can't bear to hold themselves. The road stretched out ahead of me, a ribbon of black silk under the moonlight. I thought about the box under the seat, and the woman who had spent her last breath making sure I found it. The silence of the highway didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a conversation that was finally, after all these years, being allowed to continue. I touched the brim of my cap, a silent salute to the horizon. "I'm coming home, Elle," I whispered into the cab. "Just got a few more miles to go." Thank you for watching, and if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.